Also, just to note, this panel is being recorded, so if you have questions at the end, if we can make sure you grab a mic so they can record your question as well.
Okay, thanks, Katie. And one of our speakers was not able to make it. He's stuck in Chicago at the airport because they had horrible thunderstorms here. So he has a replacement, and I'm going to be calling him on the phone, and we're going to try and patch this in. So if you could just give me a moment here. Richard Boyce was to be one of our speakers, and Paul Steinberg is actually going to be sitting in for him. Let's see if I can get him on the phone. Patch him in. Hang on a second, I'm going to try and patch you in, all right? Hopefully this will all work. Paul? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. There you go, technology. Right to the cell phone. Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to this morning's panel discussion as part of the ACT Chesapeake TDM Symposium. It's also being organized by the Transportation Demand Management Institute, or TDMI. I'm the current president of TDMI, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing educational opportunities to the TDM community, such as this panel discussion that's occurring today, as well as compiling existing research on TDM and providing it in a one-stop location, which happens to be the TDM website at transportation2.org. Today's session, as Katie mentioned, is being recorded by the Center for Urban Transportation Research, or CUTR. And I'd like to thank Phil Winters and his staff, along with my staff member, Stephen Finnefrock, as well as Katie Seiler, and the team here at George Mason for all of their IT support to make this recording happen. It was no easy feat, let me tell you. We were here pretty early today just to kind of run through all of this. The final recording of this session will be made available to the TDM community at large at the transportation2.org website, and will be announced to the TDM lister. So with us today are some dynamic panelists whom I'm going to introduce in a bit. Thanks. I just kind of want to give you a general overview of this morning's session. As many of you know, technology has been at the forefront when it comes to changing the way things are done, whether it's correspondence, paying bills online, banking, entertainment, or shopping. There's an app for that. So recently, that hasn't been the case for ride-sharing. However, in the past few years, and in particular this past year, there's been a proliferation of what we call real-time dynamic ride-sharing apps that have been at the forefront of providing this type of service. And it's been happening in urban areas all across the country. This has also led to the expansion of how the public shares a ride, whether it's to work or for some other reason. So today's panelists are going to share information with you from their own perspective on how these new services fit into the transportation realm, whether it's commuting or other trips being taken. There have been definite implications on how these services are impacting the taxi cab industry, and there are also maybe some liability concerns that need to be considered. In addition, many TDM programs are grappling with whether or not these real-time ride matching services how they get integrated into traditional TDM programs. So to get at the core of some of these issues, hopefully this will work. We may need to first look at how ride-sharing evolved. According to MIT research on ride-sharing history and statistics, the first historical incidence of ride-sharing success was the jitney craze of 1914. When Ford started producing the Model T, the vehicle was wildly popular. In 1908, there were about 6,000 Model Ts that were produced. In 1916, there were 377,000. Because the vehicle was so affordable, the streetcars of the time faced some really stiff competition. And when the economy tanked due to a recession in 1914 and the outbreak of World War I, many Model T owners in LA, that's where it all starts all the time, right, LA, they began to pick up streetcar passengers in exchange for a jitney, which was the 5-cent streetcar fare. This idea spread rapidly, and just after a mere 6 months, LA had issued over 1,500 chauffeur licenses for jitney operation. In San Francisco, there were over 1,400 jitneys operating in 1915. The idea spread from west to east in 9 months. Passengers loved the option because it was a much better ride than hopping onto the streetcar, and the jitneys were anywhere from 1.5 to 2 times faster than the streetcar. So travel time savings, route flexibility, and mode choice were on the plus side for the passengers. All good things, but there were also issues, mainly aggressive driving and lots of accidents. The big question was whether or not jitneys were a form of ride sharing or just unregulated taxi cab service. It's very similar to the debate that's going on today with the real-time ride matching applications. Many of the drivers were unemployed and had specifically purchased a vehicle to operate a jitney service in order to make a living. In a survey of Houston jitney drivers in 1915, 62% made only 1 or 2 round trips on the day of the survey, suggesting that they were probably commuting to and from work. And that would constitute a commuting work trip as a primary purpose and providing the jitney service as a secondary purpose. So in these cases, generation of revenue was not the main purpose of operating the vehicle, but it would serve as a form of ride sharing. Eventually, the jitney services went away, mainly because of safety concerns and the loss of revenue for the streetcars, and in turn, local governments were also relying on streetcar taxes based on a percentage of that revenue, so there were a lot of concerns in that arena as well. So moving forward, during World War II, the failure of government efforts to cut gasoline consumption through voluntary compliance led to gasoline rationing in late 1942. Followed by a reduction in the national speed limits to 35 miles an hour. This was the first nationwide attempt at implementing a TDM in order that the federal government could reduce civilian fuel consumption. For over a year, the Petroleum Administration for War tried to convince consumers, suppliers, and retailers to cut gasoline use by 1/3 through voluntary compliance. This strictly voluntary approach failed. However, some federal agencies promoted voluntary carpooling, and the Department of War issued regulations in 1942 requiring war-related manufacturers to start rideshare programs. These companies were required to survey employee travel patterns, submit a plan to encourage carpooling, and the use of public transit. During the war, a variety of public and private organizations helped promote ride-sharing. Many employers not involved in the war efforts, such as auto clubs, women's clubs, and neighborhood groups, supported the implementation of TDM programs as well. For instance, the American Legion and the Auto Club of New York provided free carpool matching services. Many employers also offered incentives to their employees, such as extra gasoline coupons, tire allocations, preferential parking, and special carpool insurance for employees who would participate in ride sharing. So the combination of voluntary and mandatory measures proved highly successful. According to spot checks made under a study by the Highway Research Advisory Committee, average vehicle occupancy rose from 2.0 persons per car in July of 1942 to 2.7 persons per car in March of 1943. Another study of war-related manufacturing plants nationwide found an average of 2.9 persons per vehicle. So from 1941 to 1944, the total miles traveled by vehicles on American roads actually decreased by 1/3. By the end of the war in 1945, public transit ridership in America had reached an all-time high at 23.3 billion passengers. In the past, most employers didn't concern themselves with how their employees got to work. In a special report prepared for the Transportation Research Board in 1981 by James Lauer entitled Private Sector Ride-Sharing Operations, the report outlines the fact that it has been a practice in industry that it is the employee's responsibility to get to work. This principle has been supported by the IRS and through their service rulings, and it's interesting to know However, that when there is a business reason for the employer to get involved with ride sharing, many social and institutional barriers can and are eliminated. That's something just to kind of keep in mind as we're talking about our subject matter today. Even in the early years of suburbanization, employers not located within walking distance of workers' homes or near inexpensive public transportation often assisted employees with their commute, including the offering of ride-sharing programs. Although ride-sharing declined during the decades following World War II, several major employers around the country maintained existing commuter assistance programs and started new ones. In many cases, employers got involved because of severe parking shortages or chronic local traffic congestion. Some employers started TDM programs after relocating to low-density suburban areas with limited or non-existing public transportation services. Others subsidized private ride-sharing and transit programs to avoid construction of expensive parking garages. The energy crisis in the early 1970s and in the 1980s brought widespread interest in ride-sharing and public transportation. Severe gasoline shortages shocked commuters and alarmed employers who soon learned that commuting difficulties could lower worker productivity. As a result, employer-sponsored ride-sharing programs once again became common. Companies experimented with a variety of innovative strategies and incentives intended to get commuters out of long lines at the fuel pump on the way to work. These include flexible work hours, employer-subsidized bus passes, payroll deduction for bus passes, favored treatment for pooling vehicles, and company-sponsored rideshare matching and subscription buses. So, moving forward into the 1980s and early 1990s, focus and attention was placed on ride-sharing programs based on air quality and congestion management requirements. And these were at the federal, state, and local levels. Some urban areas also adopted employee commute trip reduction programs, and others had voluntary efforts to basically meet air quality conformity goals and requirements. So to set things in context, I think first we need to talk about the definition of ride-sharing. Bureau of Transportation Statistics defines ride-sharing as a form of transportation other than public transit in which more than one person shares the use of the vehicle, such as a van or a car to make the trip, also known as carpooling or vanpooling. Given the nature of human behavior, I think that most everyone is going to agree that convincing the public to ride-share is not something that is easily accomplished. Facts are that in the early 1970s and 1980s, carpools accounted for about 20% of the work trips. And in the U.S., this percentage of trips has been higher than that of other developed countries. That's mainly because transit infrastructure in the U.S. is not as prevalent. However, it's also important to note that there's been a renaissance regarding interest in ride-sharing, primarily because of higher gasoline prices, but also because of traffic congestion. Ride-sharing is now hovering in the 10% range of work trips. One of the questions has been whether or not technology has affected travel behavior when it comes to ride-sharing. In early years, ride matching was done through employers on simple bulletin boards or ride boards. Local agencies had XY grid maps and would hand match applicants and send them typewritten letters. Then the mainframe came along and computerized everything. Personal computer then came along and workers were able to manage the inputs and outputs much easier. And then when the internet came along, agencies were able to put up websites to facilitate ride matching services, which have eventually become self-serve for the public. With the recent advent of smartphones and tablets, there's been the proliferation of real-time ride matching applications and services, and that's where we are today. So it's probably too early to tell for the current real-time ride matching technology in terms of how it's going to perform, but the overall question is whether or not technology has made a difference in travel behavior changes. I guess some additional questions are, how are legal implications being addressed for the new real-time ride matching services? What are the liability issues, and how are they being addressed? Other questions include how these services fit into the IRS's definitions, whether or not sharing a ride that was not intended to go to the destination of the rider is environmentally beneficial. And furthermore, should these types of trips be defined as an unlicensed taxi cab? So, here with us today to answer some of these questions and give us their insight on this topic. And then all of the bios are in detailed format are in your program, so I'm not going to really go into the detail. But Our first panelist is going to be Susan Heinrich, who up until now was with the MTC. She actually implemented and operated the TDM program at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she's now transitioning to ICF Consulting. Susan is going to be giving us an overview of the various technology-enabled rideshare services and how those compare to the traditional ride-sharing services provided. In particular, she is very familiar with the Bay Area and the situations that have cropped up with various providers. Susan will also address the impact of these services and on their what those impacts have with the ride-sharing industry. Our next panelist will be Robert Worth. He's the president of Diamond Transportation Services, and he's also the president-elect of the Taxi Cab, Limousine, and Paratransit Association, or TLPA. Robbie is going to be discussing the TLPA's viewpoint of these dynamic ride-sharing services and hone in on a few of the situations that have materialized in various parts of the country as a result of regulatory issues with the taxi cab industry. Next, Andrew Arnold with Lancer Insurance will then be speaking. He's going to be speaking on the liability issues regarding some of these real-time ride matching services for the providers, as well as the safeguards that should be in place, as well as potential liability for organizations promoting these services. Lastly, our final speaker is going to be Paul, who's on the phone. He's the director of the Americas for Avago, and he's responsible for everything on the continent for Avago, and he's going to be discussing where the technology-enabled ride-sharing industry is heading, its impact, as well as what types of technology should be used to meet regulatory requirements for both ride-sharing and taxi cab library services. So each speaker is going to be presenting for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer. As Katie mentioned, we are recording this session. So what I will do is that during the Q&A session, we have a portable mic, so I'll just carry that around the room just so that we can capture your questions, and that'll be on the recording. So with that, I'm going to invite Susan up to the podium. Get your presentation up here. This one. There we go. There we go.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me? Hi everyone. I'm Susan Heinrich, and as Nick mentioned, for the last 10 years, I managed the 511 rideshare program in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm now transitioning happily. It's bittersweet, of course. Every change in life is like that, but I am transitioning to ICF Consulting because I moved back to this side of the country, back to my hometown to be closer to family. And so I'm happy to still be able to be involved in TDM and on this side of the country. So, but the place that I'll be speaking to from today is from my experience in managing the rideshare program in the Bay Area. Okay, so first I thought I would just kind of go over an overview of technology-enabled ride-sharing. This is something that I've been following and kind of researching, and over the last several years I did my graduate research on the topic, and I've traveled to all the different cities in the country that have casual carpooling, or slugging as it's called on this side of the country. So anyways, and Nick kind of mentioned this too, the technology for ride sharing is continually evolving. We started off with bulletin boards, and people would post paper notes on the bulletin board, maybe in the cafeteria or the lobby of their work. And also, there are no technology options like samples, or speaking to your coworker over the cubicle to say, hey, let's ride to work together. And then And then it's gone all the way to recent developments in ride matching, where we're helping people match their routes based on radial and route-based matching. So technology has come, very long ways, that range in options. And mostly the evolution of the technology has helped with decreasing the time that you spend for advanced planning of your carpool. So over time, it's been that's the need that we see that we are addressing with technology, is really reducing that time that you need to spend to plan your carpool. So like I was saying, there's a range in the technology-assisted ride sharing. There's no technology at all, which would either be, casual carpooling, slugging. Then we have online ride boards, which, like internet-based, Craigslist or what have you. And then we have an even more instant matching option, which would be the online ride matching systems that most regional agencies offer now, where you get an instant match list. It's not necessarily an instant carpool, but you get the instant list, and you can at least see what your options are. Then you have to go forth and call or email the person. And then lastly, what we've been seeing recently over the last few years is really viable options in making instant carpools. So you get the instant match, and then 5 to 10 minutes later, you should be able to get into a car with someone. So, as I kind of mentioned, I think over the years, have been continually tasking technology with addressing several issues. Number one, always increasing usage. So how can we get more people to carpool? Because as Nick also mentioned, over the last 20, 30 years, carpooling mode share has gone down. And so at the same time, we're trying to expand the market, increase the usage, as well as expanding the types of trip that carpooling can help people get places, and not just for work. So the easiest way to help people carpool in the past has always been to work, because you have this, critical mass of people going to the same place every morning. So carpooling hasn't really worked that well for trips outside of commuting, but hopefully technology can help create or make people aware of critical masses in places other than just work. And then also we've tasked technology with helping us reduce the barriers. We always hear that people say, it takes too much time, it's too much commitment, it's not flexible enough. If I get to work in my carpool, but then I have something else at the end of the day, I can't get home. And so technology, we hoped that technology would help address this by enabling you to take different carpool trips with different partners in the morning and versus the evening. So I was just talking about this, removing barriers, time and commitment. And so some things that we still have to resolve with real-time ride sharing, and these issues have been coming up more and more lately, is this issue of increased liability. Whether it's perceived or real, there is this issue of increased liability with the real time, because you don't have that advanced planning time to get comfortable with your carpool partner and get to know them and ensure your safety and things like that. Theoretically, you have 5 to 10 minutes from the time that you find out about this carpool match to the time you would get in the car with the person. Not much time to learn about each other. And so what we've been asking ourselves is technology the answer to that, or is there something else that's going to enable this decreased time of planning our carpools? We're currently testing these real-time ride matching programs across the country on different markets. We're there's publicly funded pilots. So in San Francisco Bay Area, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, where I worked for 10 years, they have funded a pilot program where 3 different counties, Contra Costa, Marin, and Sonoma, which are kind of the more rural or suburban counties around San Francisco, the place where people live and then commute into the city. Those 3 counties are testing a real-time ride matching program. And so with these publicly funded pilots, the government agencies are forced to, really look into this liability issue. Then there's the private sector, who is also testing these real-time ride matching systems, and they're really more market-driven. At the same time that they're market-driven, the liability issue still comes up, and it's the question of, who should be overlooking these programs and really ensuring the safety or regulating it somewhat. So I've given it a little bit of thought over the years about what the differences are between these publicly funded pilot projects and the privately initiated projects. Now, these differences are perceived or real. And so this table is a combination of both. So please no one be offended if there's something in here that I'm saying. It's not necessarily that everything here in this table is a fact. But the fact of it is that some of these things are perceptions, and we have to deal with them, whether real or not. So the first difference, I think, is really in the trip type. As I was saying earlier, we have been testing technology to help us create a critical mass for not just work trips. The public systems that we've implemented, they really encourage people to share the existing trips. So this would be a trip you're already taking. Now the market-driven, privately initiated programs, they do the same thing. They do help people share existing trips, but it also enables the driver to make a new trip and take someone somewhere that maybe they weren't necessarily going. But then the driver could make a profit. There's the cost structure, which is different. In publicly funded rideshare programs, we encourage the driver and the rider to share the existing costs. So either it's a very minimal cost, or there's no cost at all. The driver and the rider agree that they're both getting a benefit in time savings or something. Private sector, again, they're more market-driven, and so the driver makes a profit. It might not be a large profit, or it may be a large profit. There's no regulation, so we're not sure there. And then lastly, I've been referring to this question of liability. Publicly funded programs, over the years, we've all come to an agreement that the liability is clearly defined. We say that the safety is the responsibility of the riders and drivers. It's up to them to ensure that the quality of the character of their driver or their rider is safe. Now, in the privately initiated pilot programs that are happening, some of them are providing varied levels of insurance to kind of deal with this. Some of them are using crowdsourced ratings, so to help users kind of see, oh well, there's 50 people that say that this person's safe, so that must be a good indication. But the responsibility is somewhat ambiguous. It could be, it's part. Responsibility is part on the rider or driver. The other part is on the operator of the program. So these are some of the questions that we've been just kind of keeping our eyes out for and watching and monitoring, because over time, we're publicly funded programs that have been around, we've been, we worry that the outcomes of some of these liability questions could impact negatively the rideshare programs that have been in existence for 20, 30 years now, 40 years. Sometimes I forget we're already beyond 2010. Anyways, and so, we just keep our eyes open to see what's going on with these programs, because while we support them and the idea of them, the conversations and the dialogue that have been happening about the liability in some of these programs, like I was saying, the perceptions can sometimes become realities, and wrongly so. And so we're just trying to keep our eyes open and make sure that we can make clear distinctions between traditional rideshare programs and the new real-time rideshare programs. And also at the same time, how can we work together and integrate real-time functionalities into traditional rideshare programs? So it's an ongoing dialogue that I think that we've all been having, and I guess only time will tell where it goes. So I'm interested to hear the other speakers today and their perspectives, and hope it's a active and lively discussion.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so. Okay. My name is Robbie Worth, and I'm the president of Diamond Transportation Services, and also the president-elect of the Taxi Cab Limousine Paratransit Association. Nick gave a little bit of background, but I'm actually from right here in Falls Church, Virginia, and I grew up in this area, went to Virginia Tech, taught school for 3 years, and went to work in minor league baseball, where the owner of a cab company dragged me off the field, saw me raking the field one day and said, "That guy's a hard worker, maybe he could run my cab companies." And that happened right here in Arlington and Alexandria. I grew up in the taxi cab industry. I'm no longer doing taxi cabs. I migrated over to the paratransit field, and actually bought a van and then a bus, a school bus, actually, to transport special needs kids in this area that have cerebral palsy and muscular dystrophy. And occasionally I'd show up at my kids' school and the yellow school bus, to their great embarrassment. And they used to call my father the Unitarian bus driver. That's how they describe him. So I have a long history in the industry, and this issue that we have before us today, we consider one of the largest threats to the taxi cab industry that's come forth since the 1970s and 80s, when deregulation came through. Back in 1974, we ran a program, or one of the first of its kind in Alexandria, a senior taxi cab program that was actually run by the Metro bus service that picked seniors up door to door in Alexandria and would take them to the grocery stores in one of these 45, 50-foot buses. And we found that getting them there was okay, but coming back, they all came back at different times. So we went to a taxi cab service, and the taxi cabs were much more flexible. They were much less expensive. They were regulated by the city of Alexandria. Their insurance was set, and every cab we knew had insurance. Their drivers had been through FBI fingerprinting tests, and we knew who the drivers were, and it was a highly regulated environment. So they went to this system, and that system exists still to this day as one of the models for transporting seniors in the country. It's called Senior Taxi right here in the city of Alexandria. The reason I bring up that type of service is because most of the trips in this service are $2 to $8 trips in a small geographic area. And the drivers usually don't like short trips in taxi cabs, but they also get the long trips going to Dulles Airport or other areas. And when you put their day together, the short trips and the long trips make their day and make the economic vitality of the taxi industry be able to perform these community-based services. Due to the explosive proliferation of smartphone apps involving taxicab and limousine transportation, it's more crucial than ever that your membership and others be able to distinguish between legitimate app dispatch services that take the pains to protect passengers and what we call rogue app dispatch services that we feel continue to threaten passenger safety. During the 1970s and 1980s, deregulation, including in the taxicab industry, swept across America. Most cities found it went in the wrong direction. Higher fares, increased trip refusals, significant overcharging of passengers, aggressive solicitation, deterioration of vehicles, and other illegal activities led to dramatic consumer complaints, and many of these cities, if not all of them, have re-regulated. Examples are Seattle and New Orleans. The taxicab industry believes in limited regulation that provides for the safety of the public and sets fares to avoid price gouging, and that serves all areas of the community at all times in a non-discriminatory manner. Rogue apps, we call rogue apps, meanwhile refuse to characterize themselves as taxicab dispatching service and insist they do not need to comply with local laws governing all other taxicab dispatching services. Contrary to what the high-tech rogue app spokespeople say, our industry has a high level of sophistication and technology. Just right up the street, there is Red Top Cab. It's one of the great examples of, they have their own application. They tell you by digital dispatch to your cell phone when your cab has been dispatched. They call you out when they reach the front of your location, and they also signal you when the cab has actually been dispatched. The taxicab industry was the first industry in the early 70s to place computerized dispatch terminals in their vehicles. This was in Ottawa, Canada. Then the media and others should also understand that the vast majority of legitimate taxicab services are small businesses. A far cry from the tens of millions of dollars that's being funneled by Wall Street to such firms as Uber from Goldman Sachs and celebrity investors that allow them to hire the nation's top lobbyists. Such influence is well out of reach of our industry, because we're, as an industry, fragmented and small companies that exist in communities all over the country. What we did was to kind of give an idea of where we're coming from on this issue of using apps, and it blends into the ride-sharing aspect of it as well, because some of the app companies label themselves as ride-sharing companies. We kind of labeled them using a red light, yellow light, green light rating system. And I'd just like to go over a couple of them. You might have heard of these, and if you haven't heard of them, you'll hear about them in the future. The first one, probably most famous, came out of San Francisco, where this started. And it started really because of poor taxicab service. The localities there would not issue additional medallions. Service became poor, so a company called Uber started. And Uber, you can download the app onto your telephone. You can order an Uber car directly from your phone. You can track the car on your phone, and it works quite nicely. Uber maintains a driver and passenger rating system, so both the driver can rate the passenger, and the passenger can rate the driver. We believe that leads to discrimination a lot of times especially in lower economic areas of a city. Sidecar is an app based in San Francisco. It operates in San Francisco Bay Area, Seattle, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Sidecar claims to vet drivers and vehicles through its own internal process and criminal background checks. Passengers do not have to pay for Sidecar and trips, and instead are prompted by the app to make a voluntary contribution. Sidecar maintains also a driver passenger rating system that allows for either party to rate the trip based on any number of subjective or possibly illegal factors, and ensures that passengers who want to continue to use the service will pay a donation. Lyft is an app again launched in San Francisco by a company called Zimride. Lyft currently operates in the Bay Area and has announced plans to cover more cities in the U.S. And Lyft directly connects Lyft passengers with Lyft drivers. Lyft does not require its drivers to hold either a taxi cab or a limo license, nor does it require its vehicles to be licensed or insured as for-hired vehicles. So we've rated those three services, Uber, Sidecar, and Lyft, as red light. Halo is a London-based app, and Halo deals only with licensed taxicab drivers. So we have rated them yellow because they are making sure that they're only using, it started in London, where the London-based taxi industry takes 3 years to get a license. It's very highly regulated. So we have rated them as yellow. In fact, posts on Halo's driver blog suggest that it may pay New York City taxicab drivers directly for trips, which is a contravention of city regulations, but they have come to New York, they are in Toronto. Taxi Magic is in Alexandria, Virginia, uses a different business plan in that they go through the companies. And if you've been in the back of a taxi in this area, they're predominant. You have the card swipe in the back of the taxi. It all goes through the fleet. You call the regular company, but they use Taxi Magic app. And because they go through the fleets, and the fleets are all regulated, we rate Taxi Magic as green. Go Fast Cab is another one. It's located in about 15 American cities. And Flywheel also, which just charges the driver like a 60-cent fee to get the call through the dispatch services. Both those companies we rate as green because they actually license taxi cab companies in order to, their applications go through the companies in order to get the trips. Rogue apps would have regulators and the public believe that they're not taxi services. We disagree with that. We think they're acting as taxi services. For the right to provide immediate response service, the taxi driver, the taxi vehicle, and the taxi dispatch service are all held to a more rigorous regulatory standard because the passenger has no way to vet the driver, vehicle, and dispatch service in advance of the trip. For that reason, taxi drivers must clear a criminal background check, and here in Arlington, it's a fingerprinted FBI check, and a driving history review that is conducted by the regulatory agency. Taxi cab vehicle must also pass the regulator's safety inspection and have a unique colorful marking to clearly distinguish it as a taxi cab. The service must provide proof of commercial transportation liability insurance, and the insurance issue was brought up, and I'll address it again at the end. They use regular inspected meters that charge a rate that are set by a public regulatory agency and provide community-wide non-discriminatory service, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Taxi cabs are typically regulated by the city level of government and assure strict enforcement of extensive taxi cab regulations. Limousines, on the other hand, are usually operated just on fitness only, insurance only. There's no vetting of the drivers, usually. In some cities there are. And limos are the vehicles limos and sedans that companies like Uber are contracting the most with, at least in the cities that we are aware of. Simply put, taxis are highly regulated because they provide immediate response service. If rogue apps are allowed to swoop in and provide taxi service that is not licensed to provide, then they will only take the most affluent customers, leaving taxi cabs with the shortest of trips in the poorest of neighborhoods. In other words, the ability of a taxi cab to be the only service allowed to accept on-demand customers offsets the extra safety regulatory costs, as well as the cost of operating 24/7 and servicing low economic neighborhoods, the elderly, and disabled. If Sidecar, Lyft, and Uber and other rogue apps are allowed to act like taxi cab services and not held to accountability standards the same as taxi cab safety and community-wide service regulations, this creates an unfair and unlevel playing field and ultimately harm passengers that are in low income or who have disabilities and otherwise are not served by the rogue apps. One thing is that these apps have is the rating of the passengers, and we believe that the secret rating of passengers fosters and institutionalizes unlawful denial of service based on a passenger's race, age, sex, neighborhood, or mobility requirements. Another aspect of in terms of the liability aspects, when you sign up for these apps, when you plug in a new software system in your computer, and they go down and you have to hit the block where you accept the agreement from the software company, how many people really read what's in the software agreements? We check the box and we go on. Well, when you sign up for Uber, they have a disclaimer, and this part of the disclaimer reads as follows: that you check off in order to be eligible for the service. You may be exposed to transportation that is potentially dangerous, offensive, harmful to minors, unsafe, or otherwise objectionable, and that you use the application and the service at your own risk. And you sign off on that before you use Uber. Some of our experts in the industry, I'll just quote Dr. Ray Mundy, from the Director of Center of Transportation Studies. If we pretend that apps don't need to adhere to local taxi and limousine regulations, we're going to regret the consequences. People may forget that we've been there before. In the 70s and 80s, lots of cities tried to deregulate the taxi cabs. It didn't work. Safety and service to our vulnerable citizens were compromised, and passengers complained about price gouging. It caused a lot of regret, and it was a complete failure. Bill Rouse, our president, states, "The advent of transportation apps is exciting and something the industry embraces. However, we must insist on full compliance with the law to protect the people who ride in the for-hire vehicles." And I'd like to just mention the insurance issue. I know that with Sidecar and Lyft, one of the companies holds a $1 million umbrella policy. I think one is completely relying on the individual's insurance on their own personal car. I hope to hear more about the insurance aspects of the service from our insurance expert. But Alexandria and Arlington, our local surrounding jurisdictions, the places you come from, they set the insurance rates for each vehicle. And if we're going to pay those insurance rates for taxi cabs, the apps should have the same, if not higher, insurance rates for the vehicles that they're going to use in the service. I think that's about it for me. Okay.
With Lancer Insurance, we don't write taxi cabs as a product. However, we do cover limousines and charter buses. I think Robbie did a good part of my work as far as explaining, laying the groundwork for it. Most of these road taxis are probably relying on personal insurance on their cars, and in most cases, personal policies exclude for higher coverage. So there's probably not a lot of coverage there. If it's a bad accident, they'll walk away from it. We also do car rental coverage. We just had a Florida incident where they had rented a car for a taxi company. There was an accident, and we declined coverage because it's excluded from our car rental policy. Having an umbrella over this kind of a rogue app type situation probably isn't going to work either, because the question will be whether, that software company has an insurable interest in a privately owned car. Personal injury lawyers are going to have a field day. I am short too. Other than that, it's pretty gray for a while, until you have some test cases come out. I'm going to use an industry that I know a little bit better, only because it's a few years ahead of this software revolution, and it's peer-to-peer car rental. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. And that came about with the recession in '08. Started getting a lot of calls from private citizens who wanted car rental on their personal car because they only used it on the weekends, and they had an expensive lease, and they wanted to rent it out during the week. I said no, because they would be doubly insured. Our policy excluded this type of coverage, but that's where it began. A company called Relay Rides in Boston, one of the first companies. They're currently insured by Berkshire Hathaway with $1 million policy. They've been in existence, I guess, like 2010. Since probably '09. Their first test case came with a fatal accident last spring, where this young woman, an MIT graduate student, former Google employee, decided she used her car about once a week. She was going to put it in this program. The person who rented the vehicle was killed, was at fault. 4 other people were critically injured. We'll see where that goes. You have a personal lines carrier, you have $1 million coverage through Berkshire Hathaway. It's probably not going to be enough. She's probably going to be privately sued. But that kind of can lead you to know that it's going to be a while before you see some test cases in the private sector that will drive these companies away. as far as public policy, I think there's enough there through public statutes like California, Washington, Oregon, saying it's okay for people to do peer-to-peer car rental. So legally, they have some fallback. But personal lines carriers came out, like Geico, said it was excluded from the policy. If they found you doing it, you would be non-renewed, canceled immediately. Yes, Geico is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, so you can see the concept there. So I think, you know, these rogue apps, they're not going to be worried about, you know, the vehicles themselves. One of the things that people can be sued for as a company is mechanical defect. Another one is negligent entrustment. You know, how well do you vet the driver as far as drug and alcohol screening? That regular taxi drivers have to go through these screening processes in business. And I think you can see the difference between it. There's not a lot there with these rogue apps. Really, software companies shouldn't be in the taxi business. It's just
Okay, Paul, are you still with us?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Let me try and get your presentation up here. I think our computer is down.
Don't need to say my name, that's fine.
Okay, you're up.
Right, thanks so much for the opportunity, and I hope at the end of the presentation that Robbie will throw me in the green light category. My name is Paul Steinberg. I'm responsible for the Americas for Abago Corporation. We are a real-time, we call ourselves a real-time ride-sharing product. And what I'd like to do here quickly is just get through a few slides that briefly give the history of what we've been trying to accomplish and compare ourselves and contrast ourselves to these other services. Is there an echo or are we okay?
I think you're okay. Is everyone hearing Paul okay? Yeah.
Okay, so let's start what we've been trying to accomplish as the Beta Corporation. For those of you who know us, we're repetitive, but for those of you who don't, our first U.S. test for trying to implement real-time ride sharing, where we try to hook up commuters who are in path to and from work during rush hour in the Seattle area, primarily with anchors of the University of Washington and Microsoft. And what we learned through that process is that if you create a bunch of barriers for people to participate, you're going to lose a lot of participation. But we did also learn that it provides a reliable, high level of service that more than 40% will use it on a regular basis. So that was a very short test in 2011. In 2012, we had a pilot that started in Bergen, Norway. And what we learned there is that people that participate in ride sharing to and from work, it's not about money and tips and prices. It's about gaining access to faster lanes on the highway or better parking, and that they've been able to create a vibrant, self-sustained RTR community without government dollars artificially inflating it. And I'm going to explain how we're using that model now in the Bay Area pilot that Susan was to. We were the technology vendor selected by the 3 counties. And what we're learning here is that we can take those learnings from Bergen and apply them into our pilots in the U.S. And the results of that have been very promising. So, for example, in Sonoma, which is extremely rural, this is wine country, we have a couple of small community colleges up there. and they're successfully pulling more than 30 cars every day off the parking lot of one of these small community colleges, which for them is a huge deal when they were out of parking. We just launched in Contra Costa County, and in less than 2 weeks of outreach at one employment center, Contra Costa Center, outreaching to parts of 4,000 employees, more than 500 have already joined us in the first 2 weeks. So I know that there is a need that can be filled, and as these pilots continue, we hope to be able to turn this into something that can be much easier to deploy in places like Texas, where you'll see another project launch, as well as other cities willing to do this on their own. In Bergen, as I mentioned, it's self-sustaining. We're seeing about a 10 to 20% month-over-month growth in usage. And this is heavily through employer-focused outreach with ambassadors that basically do the outreach on behalf of the CDN community. And it's self-sustaining in the sense that the employers are funding it and not the government agents who originally kickstarted the project. In Sonoma, as I mentioned, if you log into our app and type in an address in Sonoma for rush hour time, you'll find many people, more than 50, close to 100 people online using the service with routes during rush hour time. You're not going to find a lot of trips in the middle of the day, and certainly not on weekends, as we're trying to solve a commute problem. So let me contrast us versus hopefully we would not be in the category that has been referred to as road taxi apps. We are, all of our projects in the U.S. are funded by the federal government. All of our projects are either funded through value pricing, grants, or through CMAQ dollars, which is just mitigation dollars. And I won't burden you with the long legislation, but U.S. Congress and President Obama signed into law just last year, passed 21 legislation, which they're all aware. And in Section 1501 is the first time carpooling has been redefined since 1970, and it specifically defined real-time ride-sharing. So this is your U.S. Congress defining the term real-time ride-sharing. I won't argue with the whole paragraph. If you read through that, the very last part of the paragraph is subject to the condition that the cost recovered does not exceed the cost of the trip provided. In the Avago model, you make 20 cents a mile. It's capped at 55, 56.5 cents a mile. The point is to help recover the cost of commuting, just as someone who floods in Washington, D.C. might chip in $1 for gold, or in San Francisco or Houston, where flooding occurs every day. This is the model that we're trying to apply technology is recreate these natural environments of flooding or casual carpooling with the aid of smartphones allow you to map the people easily. And if you want to recover costs, it's capped at 20 cents a mile. But you don't have to start. You can offer a free trip. In contrast, Halo was just clearly trying to be a taxi service. They work with taxi cab drivers. They work within their existing business model. And they're trying to maybe not be exactly within the lines what the taxi industry would like, but they're certainly trying to work within the taxi industry kind of world or ecosystem. In contrast, we think Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar all belong in the taxi world. And someone, a European company called Point, a German company, would fall into traditional ride sharing, where you're not going to make a profit. Why do we think we know this? Between Rickard, who is going to present, myself, and our staff at the U.S., we've taken dozens of trips on these services. We've interviewed dozens of drivers. And they do it to make money. These are people who are either they're looking for part-time work because they don't make enough money as a waiter or a musician, or because they got laid off jobs. In all cases, they're making $20 or more per hour, and in every single case we have, they all claim that it's tax-free. So And the reason I said, why couldn't you work at Starbucks where you can make $15 an hour and get a bunch of benefits? And the difference is they make more money afterwards. Drivers are not picking up people along the regular routes. You can ask them to take you anywhere you want. They will. Some of them have restrictions of a 60-mile radius of the city that they're supposed to not go beyond. Ask them where are they driving to, and say they just flow wherever the script takes them. And in all cases, we would have examples where a driver may pass on you. It's just a nice script for them. In Richard's example, he took a sidecar trip. I've taken dozens of sidecar trips. And sidecar basically allows drivers to log in and start sharing rides whenever they want. There's no scheduling. But they are rated, and that's how they permanently boot out those drivers. And the rating also allows the drivers to decide if they want to pick me up. Very specifically in line with what you heard earlier. In the case of Lyft, or Uber, actually, it is nicer service by far. These are limo drivers, so generally the vehicles are better maintained, but it is much more expensive. In all these examples that you're seeing, Richard, you're seeing costs of $8, $15, $9. But if you look at the map, they're all about a 1-mile stretch. To operate a vehicle for 1 mile does not cost $8. So what do we think? I think they're great apps. We think it's great innovation. We don't have any opinion whether or not it violates taxi laws. However, we do have a strong opinion that they control themselves Ridesharing. When a driver's incentive is driven by an amount of money, it's dangerous habit so that they will, for example, take me to a grocery store and wait outside while I ran in to pick some groceries. Or because they'll me anywhere I'll go within a 60-mile radius. That is not an existing script that they were planning to take. That is someone that is in it to make one-off scripts for a profitable business. And we need to say that if we're going to be a PDM community, we need to define what's right and what's not. If we allow these companies to be defined as ride-sharing, then that means any regulations that come on them would have to apply to people who plug every day in Washington, D.C., everyone in casual purples in San Francisco area. And if these companies are allowed to be called ride-sharing companies, then I would have to argue that Super Shuttle should be called a van-full business and receive federal commuter tax benefit dollars, 5307 commuter tax benefit dollars, because the basically the case. I think everyone in the app community would recognize that's very different. And just like Super Shuttle is not a van pool, Uber, Sidecar, and Lyft are certainly not ride-sharing services or taxis. So let's make sure that when we talk about the differences where a driver is in it for making a profit, or a driver is taking a regular commute trip, and they might open up their door to another passenger going to their work center, share the cost of the journey, maybe, mainly to gain access to fast commute lanes and better parking. That, thank you for your time, and I apologize if you could not be there in person.
Green, by the way.
Okay, obviously green. Okay, well, thanks, Paul. And now we've heard all of the panelists, and I'd like to open it up for questions. And I'll come out to you so we can get this recorded.
Hello, my name is Stephen, and my question is for you, Mr. Worth. I've had the pleasure of living in New York, Washington, and New Orleans, and all of these taxi cab regimes have persistent claims of racial and trip destination discrimination by their taxi providers. And in New Orleans, the taxi cab industry was probably the most vehement opposition to re-regulation and improving quality standards for the system. What is your organization doing to promote self-policing against discriminatory practice and to, help the industry more constructively talk with regulators?
That's a great question. Yeah, we're familiar with, and right here in Washington, there's quite a bit of publicity of discriminatory practices to certain parts of the city and to the blind community, for example, hailing cabs on the street. And we're in favor of higher regulatory authority to make sure that those situations don't occur. We also have to meet regularly with there's an International Association of Transportation Regulators, and they give us input and feed into what can be put into ordinances, what can they do to put more teeth into the regulations that they currently have, and a lot of it is enforcement and actually having the ability to have the on-street enforcement of what regulations are currently on the books. Because I guarantee if you look at the ordinances in those cities, particularly New York, and you mentioned New Orleans, they've redone their ordinances, and they just don't have the manpower to go out and enforce what's on the books.
Other questions? Any come up to the
Hi, and this is for CLPA person. The taxi service, it seems like you're concentrating on fighting these new services primarily, instead of looking at what they're delivering and saying maybe you need to change the taxi industry somewhat. And I refer mostly to jurisdictional rules like we have around here, where it's very difficult to get a taxi like 11 o'clock at night at Union Station because they don't want to go into Maryland or into Virginia, and then they have to come back without a fare. They're not even allowed to get a fare to come back. There's inadequate availability in many areas of taxi service. Unlike New York, where you can get a taxi on the street in the city, or if you're in the outer boroughs, you can call a car service and get a car within 10 minutes. You can't do that even in the DC area. So there's reasons why there's market demand for services like Uber. So why isn't the taxi industry and TLPA changing the industry somewhat so it's more market responsive instead of trying to just keep the rules that they have?
Well, are you referring to DC predominantly, Washington, DC?
Well, I have to say most of my experience this year, but even in other places, unless you're in a center city, it's not easy to get a taxi, or you call a taxi and it's an hour as opposed to, in New York, you can call for a car service and 10 minutes later, always available, or one of their peers shows up. And you can just assume that, whereas you can't assume that in most places.
We don't like to use Washington, D.C. as an example because that is an open entry city where they do not have rules and regulations that will take care of some of the problems and issues that you bring up. For example, they've got a higher ratio of taxis to population, one of the highest levels in the country, yet you can't get a cab in certain parts of the city because all cabs are not radio dispatched. And I would agree with what you're saying. The taxi industry does have to look at some of the reasons why the Ubers of the world are popping up and existing to fill a need. Our feeling, though, is that they're filling a need only to a certain segmented part of the population, and those that can afford both their initial fee and their price surging that happens on, when the number of vehicles they have on the road goes down. So if they allowed the taxi industry to act more like Uber, as you're suggesting possibly, I would think that some of those issues would go away. But I also believe that certain segments of the population would be hurt by this because the pricing would be too high for them to afford a taxi to go to the local grocery store.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Larry. I have a question about ride sharing itself and its relationship to some of these new services. And I know a lot of us have been sort of struggling with, what is ride sharing? And since there's no real uniform definition, you could look at a lot of different sources. And so it's really, what is the purpose and what public benefit does it serve? So things like if a transit park and ride were oversubscribed and there is a need to try to supplement that, is it that that you have to have two voluntary people who are going to the same park and ride that makes that ride sharing as opposed to someone's using an app to get a driver to just pick up that person to take them to a park and ride? What is the really? Have you thought more about the essence of what ride sharing is? And how can you expand it to include some of these technologies? I guess it's for Paul and Susan.
Hey, Paul, do you want to answer that? Did you hear the question?
Yeah, this is Paul, and I think our response to that has been ride sharing should be incidental to the trip that you're already taking. And in all of our pilots, we're trying to solve the peak congestion hours, which is rush hour, morning, and evening. And so when we outreach, when we educate people, this isn't about finding a trip on the weekend that you're going in the city and you're going great. That may be where taxi services, may need further expansion of technology to better serve those one-off trips. What we're referring to is regular trips that you're taking that maybe you don't plan every Tuesday to pick someone up, but on certain days you're willing and you have the availability, and so you open up your. But these are for commute hours when we have the traffic congestion and the emission problems that we're trying to solve as a community and an association. We're not targeting one-off midday or evening trips at all, which is very different than what we would refer to as these taxi services, which may be serving a very good need, but it's a taxi service need, it's not ride sharing.
Well, I guess I would agree with what Paul was saying, with maybe one little difference, and that is, I think from the public agency perspective, our main goal is to reduce congestion and by way of reducing trips. So for us, I think that we have focused always on ride sharing for these commute hours, but I think that we're trying to expand our thinking and saying that, if it's anytime you're reducing a trip, and if you could do that by way of carpooling, we don't care. It doesn't have to be a regular trip. It doesn't have to be a repeat trip. It could be to a concert or a football game, or even, let's say, your trip on the weekend home from college and back. If you're sharing a trip, reducing a car from the road on any trip, we're interested in, we would consider that ride sharing, and that's what we're here to promote and help expand.
And I would agree with Susan, just from a regional standpoint. That's pretty much our definition. We're looking to reduce congestion and improve air quality. And if we're going to be putting more cars on the road, then that's really not. That's not how we're defining ride sharing. Okay, one last question, and we have to wrap it up.
Good morning. I'm Amy Conrick. I'm with the Job Links Employment Transportation Program at CTIA. I'm kind of weaving in and out here. I just have a question for Susan. So you talked about, we know technology can bring us only so far, whether it's in ride sharing, whether it's via taxis, whether it's via personal vehicles, whether it's carpooling. At some point, though, what have you found in your research about personal comfort, personal safety issues? So, for example, you mentioned with real-time ride share, you have about 5-10 minute window to check on ratings for the driver or what have you to see. In taxis, we have no time. We trust the regulations. In slugging, the same thing. You have absolutely no idea who you're getting in the car with. When I tell my friends about slugging in the DC area, they're just aghast. They can't believe that we actually do it. Actually, I don't do it. But so what have you found in your research? Has our risk tolerance increased so that we're more willing to get in cars with total strangers? Have you done any research on that at all?
Yeah, a little bit. I can move forward. Apparently all parts of me is short. Even with these nice tall espadrilles, they are not helping bend over the table. Yeah, so in my graduate research, I did a survey in the Bay Area, region-wide survey, and I got about 1,000 responses. And I did ask some of these kinds of questions. What is your view of doing something like a real-time ride sharing? Would you be willing to do it? What are your concerns? Why or why not would you do it? And the interesting thing that I found out of that was that it was almost an even split. It was about a little more, I don't really remember the exact numbers, but I'll say it was, something like 55-45 split. 55 said, yeah, they'd be willing to try it. And the 45 were like, no. And so I find that if people kind of come down on one side or the other, they're either completely scared to death of the idea, or they're completely open to it. And the people that are scared to death, they cite these reasons. Oh, I don't know who it is. I don't know if they have insurance. I don't know. I don't know the person. I don't have time to meet them. The people that are willing to try it are saying things like, well, hey, there's the crowdsourced user ratings, and people are getting more and more accustomed to these crowdsourced user ratings and seeing them on things like eBay and what have you. And so I think that, over time, maybe people will just become more comfortable with it. But you're right. I have heard people also with casual carpooling in the Bay Area. It's a really common thing there. But when you go to other cities, people are, that's the craziest idea I've ever heard of. But over time, it's been trusted, and people just become accustomed to it, I guess.
Okay, well, obviously this is an evolving subject, and there's going to be more dialogue in this area. What I would do is encourage everyone in the industry to stay in tune with what is happening with real-time ride matching and get involved. There are probably more issues that we didn't even touch on today. For instance, liability of organizations promoting these services. If you're promoting one of these services and there's some type of an accident, what's the liability? I think that should be a legitimate concern that we should all be taking into account. So with that, I'd like to first thank all of our panelists, Robert, Andrew, Susan, and Paul, who stepped in graciously for Richard. So if we just give them a round of applause. And secondly, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this program. Commuter Connections is one of them. I'd like to thank our three state departments of transportation, the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. And there are representatives here from those organizations, and we appreciate the support. And also Cutter, Phil, and his team for recording the session. And again, this session will be rebroadcast on the transportation2.org website. Thank you, everyone.